Okay, let's talk about those crimes, the ones that really burrow into a city's memory. For Los Angeles, well, the Black Dahlia murder has to be right at the top.
Oh, absolutely. January 47, when Elizabeth Short's body was found,
Yeah.
it wasn't just news. It was a genuine shock. The sheer bizarre, brutal nature of it just gripped everyone.
And it really hasn't let go, has it?
Not at all. And that's exactly what we're trying to dig into today. Look, we're not pretending we can solve this whole thing right now, but we want to really focus on that critical window, January 14th and 15th, 1947. The idea is to just meticulously walk through the timeline around her death to get a feel for those crucial hours.
Right, so let's unpack this source material. Our main guide here is Steve Hodel's A Timeline of Horror.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes it interesting is, well, it claims to be built on witness accounts, police reports, physical evidence, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it pieces together a very specific narrative. We'll also be pulling in details from Black Dahlia Awesome Stories and the Wikipedia page just for corroboration, especially around the discovery itself and the initial police work.
Gotcha. So this is less about the whole sprawling mystery and more a close-up on this really intense, very short period.
Exactly that. Trying to move past the pure sensation and reconstruct the sequence, the chain of events that led up to that discovery that, like you said, just stunned LA.
Okay, let's dive in. January 14th, 1947. Afternoon, around 2 p.m. It's the last time anyone confirmed seeing Elizabeth Short alive. Downtown LA, 5th and Main.
That's the one. The timeline details her running into an LAPD officer, Merrill McBride. Apparently, Short was quite upset, said some guy in a bar nearby had threatened her life.
Wow. So what happened?
Well, the officer went with her into the bar, but whoever it was, they were gone. She did manage to get her purse back, though.
And then they just went their separate ways.
Seems like it. And what's sort of chilling about it is how normal, mundane it seems.
Yeah, just a quick interaction.
Exactly. It really highlights how fast things can turn,
Yeah.
That's the last documented sighting before everything changed.
Then the timeline jumps. Later that afternoon, January 14th, say 4:30 p.m., and it runs through the night into the early morning of the 15th, maybe 6 a.m. And this is where Steve Hodel's theory about that house on Franklin Avenue comes in, 5121 Franklin.
Yes. And it's really important for you, the listener, to understand this is a very central part of Hodel's reconstruction, but it's also quite controversial.
Right, not universally accepted.
Definitely not. But the theory is that Short was taken there, allegedly by 3 people.
Yeah.
Dr. George Hodel, Steve Hodel's father, Fred Sexton, and a woman who's never been identified.
And according to this timeline, what supposedly happened inside that house is pretty horrific.
Extremely. The account includes drugging, beatings, really brutal torture, and sexual assault, specifically mentioning sodomy.
How long did this allegedly go on for?
The estimate, based on the trauma, is somewhere around 3 to 4 hours of sustained torture.
And the details of the mutilations are graphic.
Very graphic and strangely specific. There are these rounded scalpel cuts to her mouth, almost ear to ear. Some have pointed out a resemblance to Man Ray's painting, The Lovers.
That's eerie. Suggests it's a certain mindset, maybe.
It certainly raises questions. Was the killer familiar with surrealist art? Was it intentional staging? Then her right breast was completely excised, never recovered.
Never found?
Nope. Which feeds the speculation it might have been buried somewhere on that Franklin property.
God. And it continues.
Yes. Cuttings to the pubic region, and then this really bizarre, awful detail. A piece of skin with a rose tattoo was cut from her left thigh and then inserted into her vagina.
Just gratuitous cruelty.
It seems that way. And the potential Man Ray links pop up again. There were multiple crisscross scalpel cuts on her right thigh, believed by some to mimic another work, the Quivoque.
So deliberate markings, potentially.
That's the suggestion in Hodel's timeline. It also includes the detail about her being force-fed feces, specifically identified as Bandini Fertilite steer manure.
Bandini. That sounds like a brand name.
It is, and it's an interesting detail. How common would access to that specific brand of steer manure be for someone, not in farming or gardening back then? Could it point somewhere?
A potential clue, maybe. And then the cause of death.
Blunt force trauma. Multiple hard blows to her forehead. The coroner's report, and this is backed up by the other sources too, confirms this led to loss of consciousness and ultimately death from a cerebral hemorrhage.
So the blows to the head were fatal.
Yes. And after death came the bisection.
The hemicorporectomy.
Exactly, a surgical procedure. The timeline stresses this was something taught in medical schools in the 1930s for autopsies. It required, well, real surgical skill, anatomical knowledge.
Which brings us back to George Hodel's background.
Precisely. Steve Hodel points to things like a job application showing his father was the sole surgeon at a logging camp just after medical school. And apparently his med school records show he did at least a dozen autopsies.
So he would have had that specific knowledge and potentially the skill set.
That's the core of the argument. The timeline estimates the bisection itself took several hours, likely done in a bathtub. Then, meticulously washing and drying the body parts.
It sounds so clinical, detached.
Disturbingly so. Almost like a procedure rather than a frenzied attack. Which again makes you think about someone with that kind of medical or anatomical experience.
Okay, so after all that, the body parts needed to be moved. How does the timeline handle that?
It suggests they were carried out through the back door of the residence, through an inner courtyard, into the enclosed garage at the back.
Right. And then into a vehicle, presumably?
Yes. And this is where those sacks come back in. The theory uses empty 50-pound paper sacks, specifically mentioning Bandini Fertilite manure again, but also sacks that had held powdered cement to cover the body parts in the car.
And the cement sacks. Those were found at the crime scene, right? I remember reading that.
They were. Both the Awesome Stories piece and the Independent mention empty cement sacks found near the body in the lot. It definitely lends some weight to that specific detail about transportation.
So the use of those particular sacks, the Bandini ones, it's a thread connecting the alleged location to the disposal site, at least in this theory.
It's presented as a key link, yes. It raises questions about where someone would get both cement sacks and those specific manure sacks.
Okay, so now we're moving into the morning of January 15th, around 6:20 a.m. The suspect drives to that vacant lot, 3825 South Norton Avenue, Leimert Park area.
That's right. The timeline even notes the turn onto Degnan Boulevard to get there.
And the posing of the body. That was very deliberate, wasn't it?
Chillingly so. The torso halves separated by about 10 inches, her hands placed specifically over her head. That detail comes up in the inquest testimony mentioned in Awesome Stories.
It wasn't just leaving the body, he was arranging it.
Exactly, which makes you wonder, again, about the motive. Was it purely for shock value? A signature, something symbolic to the killer.
And the sacks were left there too.
Yeah, 4 or 5 of them, according to the timeline. The cement and the steer manure ones left near the body. And crucially, the LAPD did later confirm that, yes, sacks like these were used to transport her remains.
Wow. And was there anyone who saw anything?
There's mention of an eyewitness account, someone who saw a suspect and a black sedan at the spot for maybe 4 minutes around that time before it drove off heading north.
4 minutes. Enough time to place the body parts and leave.
Plausibly, yes. It's not a positive ID, of course, but it puts a car there.
So pulling back, looking at this whole reconstructed timeline, what are the big takeaways?
Well, first, the obvious brutality. But paired with that, this almost unnerving precision, the mutilations, the bisection, it strongly suggests someone with, at the very least, significant medical or surgical knowledge.
And the manure sacks.
That's a really specific, tangible detail. If those Bandini sacks could ever be definitively traced back, say, to the Hodel residence, like the theory proposes, well, that would be huge.
But, and this is a big buddy, we have to keep stressing, it's still a theory, right? It's Steve Hodel's reconstruction based on his investigation into his father. The case is still officially unsolved.
Absolutely crucial point. You see the debate online, like in that Reddit thread we looked at. People argue fiercely about George Hodel's guilt or innocence. And like the other sources say, while he was a major suspect, especially later on, he was never charged with the crime.
And the initial scene, when Betty Bersinger found the body, the police reports mention how clean she was, right? No blood at the lot itself.
Exactly. That was noted right away by the first officers. It screamed that this wasn't the murder scene. She was killed and dismembered elsewhere and then brought there.
Which fits the timeline's narrative of the Franklin house and the transportation.
It does. The coroner's findings also line up death on the 14th or 15th, cause being the head trauma and shock. And it wasn't long before even the FBI suspected someone with medical training was involved.
There were also those wiretapped recordings of George Hodel later on, weren't there? Where he supposedly made some ambiguous comments.
Yes, those are mentioned in several sources. He apparently made statements that could be interpreted as alluding to the Dahlia case and also the death of his secretary. They definitely added fuel to the fire regarding suspicion against him.
But again, interpretation is key there. It wasn't a confession.
Not by any means. And we have to be clear, while this timeline offers a very detailed, compelling narrative, it's just one theory. There were other suspects. Robert Red Manley, the last person known to have driven with her, Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner. These names come up too.
Right. So the value of this deep dive isn't necessarily saying this is what happened, but more like understanding one very specific, highly detailed reconstruction of those critical hours.
Precisely. It gives you, the listener, a framework built on one interpretation of evidence and witness accounts, letting you see the complexity and the sheer horror surrounding Elizabeth Short's final day or so. It helps appreciate why this case remains so disturbingly fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. When you put it all together like that, her last known interaction,
Yeah.
seemingly so minor, and then contrasting it with the absolute horror found in that vacant lot,
Yeah.
the gap is just immense and chilling.
It really underscores the brutality, and it's those unanswered questions that keep the Black Dahlia case alive in our minds, isn't it?
Definitely.
Think about the level of planning suggested by this timeline, the specific knowledge, surgical skill, maybe even those artistic references. What does that imply about the perpetrator, whoever they were?
It forces you to confront the psychology behind it, doesn't it? The coldness, the calculation, mixed with such extreme violence.
Exactly. It's a disturbing combination.
So for you listening, if this grabbed your interest, I really encourage you to look deeper,
Okay.
explore the different suspects, the various theories. There's so much written about it.
Yeah, and keep this timeline we've discussed and kind of in the back of your mind as you do. Compare how different theories handle these specific details, the timing, the location, the evidence, like the sacks.
There are tons of resources out there, each offering, a slightly different angle on this really dark piece of LA history.
Well, thank you for joining us as we took this deep dive into what remains a truly haunting and sadly still unsolved mystery.